Officer Jacob Renshaw stood smug in the courtroom, daring to defy Judge Naomi Ellison. A young black woman who had clawed her way through a system built to exclude her. He didn't just challenge the law, he challenged her right to exist within it. For years, Naomi faced racism cloaked in procedure, silence where justice should have roared. But today, in front of a packed courtroom, he struck her, a sitting judge. What happened next stunned the nation. Want to see what happens when power finally meets consequence? Don't scroll past this. Subscribe now, because this is the moment justice stops being polite. In the gleaming courtroom, where silence pressed like a weight on every chest, all eyes turned to Officer Jacob Renshaw, the very embodiment of arrogance in uniform. His crisp badge shimmered under the lights, but there was nothing honorable about the man who wore it. Across the room, Judge Naomi Ellison sat unmoved, a portrait of composure carved from years of surviving a system never designed for her. She wasn't just a judge, she was a storm forged from fire, a black woman who had clawed her way from the cracked sidewalks of East Point to the marble halls of Atlanta's Superior Court. And Renshaw hated every piece of it. His smirk said what his lips didn't dare. You don't belong here. He didn't just see her robe, he saw her color. He didn't just challenge her authority, he mocked it. He thought he could intimidate her, override her. But what he didn't know, what none of them knew, was that Naomi had been waiting her entire life for this exact moment. The courtroom had been tense from the moment he entered, every inch of the space thick with the unspoken history between men like Renshaw and women like Naomi. Those who wielded power, and those forced to earn it tenfold. She had read his file the night before. Dozens of complaints swept under rug after rug, whispers of excessive force, racial profiling, coerced silence. And yet, he was here, unpunished, unrepentant, and utterly convinced that the system would catch him again if he fell. But Naomi wasn't like the others. She had lived through too much to flinch now. Her father had been arrested in front of her at 12 for a crime he didn't commit. She'd watched a white officer slam him onto the hood of their car, shouting orders, ignoring protests. And now, years later, the boy who had once watched that horror unfold from the back seat had grown into the monster standing before her. It wasn't just justice on the line. It was personal. "Officer Renshaw," she said evenly, "take your seat." He didn't move. Instead, he chuckled, a slow, venom-laced sound that slid across the courtroom like poison. "I don't take orders from people like you," he said. The air shifted. Gasps hissed like leaking steam. He had said the quiet part out loud, and he meant every word. Naomi didn't blink. "This is a court of law," she said. "You will sit down, or you will be removed." Renshaw leaned forward, eyes gleaming with contempt. "I'd love to see you try." Then it happened, fast, violent, unforgettable. His fist cracked across her jaw, the sound slicing through the room like thunder. A collective scream broke out. Papers scattered. People leapt to their feet. But Naomi, she didn't fall. She wouldn't give him that. Slowly, she straightened, blood streaking her lip, eyes burning holes through his arrogance. He expected her to cower. He expected tears, maybe fear. But all he saw was something he hadn't expected. Control. Naomi reached for the gavel, not to silence the room, but to command it. "You just assaulted a sitting judge," she said, her voice ringing like steel across the chamber. "In a court of law." Renshaw's smirk faltered. He stepped back, chest heaving, still clinging to the fantasy that he was untouchable. But then she raised her hand. The bailiffs froze for a breath, then moved. The first click of handcuffs snapped through the air, and for the first time in his life, Jacob Renshaw looked afraid. "You can't do this!" he barked, thrashing against the cuffs. "Do you know who I am?" Naomi stood, walking toward him slowly, eyes locked to his. "No," she said calmly, "but after today, everyone will." And that was when it all changed. Within hours, the video of the assault spread like wildfire. Uncut, unfiltered, undeniable. A black judge struck by a white cop in her own courtroom. The image hit America like a bullet to the conscience. Social media erupted. Cable news panels blazed. Some called it justice. Others called it war. And while the department scrambled to contain the fallout, Naomi sat in her chambers, reading the statement from Renshaw's attorney. Officer Renshaw was emotionally provoked, acting in defense against a judicial overreach. The lie was familiar, the gaslighting, routine. But Naomi wasn't surprised, because systems don't collapse quietly, they fight back. The police union demanded an investigation, not into Renshaw, but into her. Accusations swirled that she was hostile, biased, unfit to rule on the case. Anonymous sources leaked stories. She has a history of being emotional. She's too ambitious, too political. The DA showed up at her office with a polite threat cloaked as advice. If you voluntarily recuse yourself, this could all go away. Naomi looked him in the eye. "I'm not going anywhere." She knew what was coming. She received death threats. Her car was tailed. Reporters dug through her past, yet she never flinched. Because they weren't just trying to silence her. They were trying to remind her of her place. But Naomi had no intention of going quietly. Then came the twist. A manila envelope appeared on her doorstep in the middle of the night. No note, no sender. Inside, a stack of redacted documents. Renshaw's internal affairs file, unedited. And on the final page, a name. Franklin Ellison, her father. The arrest that changed her life wasn't random. Renshaw had been the arresting officer. The man who cracked her jaw in that courtroom had once cracked her childhood in half. The rage that welled inside her wasn't hot. It was cold. Calculating. This wasn't just about justice anymore. It was retribution. The trial was swift. The nation watched, breathless, as Renshaw sat in the defendant's chair where he had once bullied witnesses. The evidence was airtight, the footage undeniable. Naomi didn't preside. By then, they had succeeded in having her removed from the bench. But she sat in the gallery, head held high, unbroken. And when the verdict came, the world held its breath. We, the jury, find the defendant, guilty on all counts. The gasp that followed wasn't just from the courtroom. It was from a country choking on the rare taste of real justice. Renshaw's head hung, his badge gone, his freedom revoked. And Naomi? She didn't cheer. She didn't smile. She just walked out, shoulders straight, fire still in her eyes. Because this wasn't the end. This was only the beginning. If this story shook you, if it made your blood boil, your chest rise with hope, then don't stop here. Subscribe to Tales of Twist, where justice isn't just a word, it's a reckoning. And trust me, the next chapter will leave you speechless. They always warned Lieutenant Colonel Aisha Monroe about enemies on the battlefield. Foreign combatants, insurgents, warlords, but no one ever warned her about the monsters in three-piece suits and polished shoes sitting in the halls of American power, smiling as they signed orders that destroyed lives from behind mahogany desks. The real war didn't come with bullets. It came with silence, manipulation, and erasure. and Aisha found herself fighting it alone. It began like a nightmare disguised as routine, a traffic stop on a barren Nevada highway as she returned from a reserve training mission, her uniform crisp, her posture proud, her ID clearly marked with rank and clearance. The patrol car's sirens flashed like an omen. Officer Brett Callahan swaggered toward her vehicle with the cocky smirk of a man born to be untouchable. She saw it immediately. The arrogance, the disdain, the hatred boiling just beneath the surface. He demanded her papers, questioned her tone, accused her of suspicious behavior, and when she dared to remind him she was an officer in the United States Army, his expression darkened with something ancient and vicious. "Out here," he said, voice dripping with contempt. "Your rank don't mean sut." Before she could speak again, he slammed her to the ground, zip-tied her wrists so tight she could feel the bones in her fingers pressed together, and threw her into the back of his cruiser like she was nothing more than trash to be disposed of. And he didn't take her to the local precinct. No. Brett Callahan had orders. Or permission. Maybe both. They brought her to a facility she'd never heard of. No signs, no records, no rights. A windowless compound buried in the desert where black site contractors took over. She was stripped, searched, left in a freezing cell for 48 hours. No food, no water, no explanation. She wasn't Lieutenant Colonel Monroe in that place. She was just another body to be broken. She endured interrogations that blurred the line between psychological torture and sadistic theater. They accused her of espionage. They flashed fabricated bank statements across the table, showed her photoshopped images of herself in rooms she'd never entered. "You've been compromised," they whispered, "but we can fix this, if you cooperate." She didn't break, but she bent, emotionally, mentally, spiritually. She had been trained to survive capture, but not betrayal from the nation she bled for. When she asked for a lawyer, they laughed. When she screamed for a phone call, they turned up the volume on the white noise generators outside her cell. Then, without ceremony, they released her in the middle of the night, dropped her off at a remote gas station barefoot, bleeding, with her wrists still bruised and a burner phone placed in her pocket with a single text. "Stay quiet." But Aisha didn't stay quiet. She went public. She contacted lawyers, journalists, former commanders. She tried to tell her story, but by then, the smear campaign had already begun. Her military record was sealed, her security clearance revoked. Anonymous sources painted her as unstable. "She's had behavioral issues before," one report read. "Possible PTSD." Photos were leaked showing her at Black Lives Matter protests. Conservative networks ran headlines like, "Radicalized soldier or victim of her own politics." But the final blow came when a high-quality deepfake video appeared on every screen in America. In it, Aisha appeared to be meeting with a known terrorist calmly discussing plans to leak U.S. intelligence and sabotage overseas operations. It wasn't real. The voice sounded like hers. The face moved like hers. But it wasn't her. Yet the world believed it. The media aired it relentlessly. Senators called for her arrest. Veterans turned their backs on her. Military officials said she had disgraced the uniform. Death threats followed. Her image, once used on recruitment posters, was defaced and turned into memes branding her the traitor colonel. Her bank accounts were frozen pending investigation. Her property was seized. Her car vandalized. Her VA health benefits suspended until further review. And when she tried to protest, to fight back, she was slapped with a gag order. The military justice system she had dedicated her life to now treated her like a national threat. Her apartment was raided. Her journal, A private record of everything she endured was confiscated under national security concerns. Her service weapon license was revoked. The last straw came when her goddaughter, the one she raised like her own child, was expelled from her charter school for safety reasons after being attacked by classmates who screamed, "Your mom's a terrorist!" Aisha broke. Not publicly, not loudly, but inwardly, quietly, in a way that made the world feel too small to hold her pain. She stayed in motels with the curtains drawn tight. She stopped answering the phone. She didn't eat for days. The woman who once led elite recon units through active combat zones now found herself unable to leave her bed. She tried calling the few friends she still trusted, but they had been warned. Association with her could jeopardize their careers. Even the journalists who once promised to run her story backed out, saying they couldn't verify the facts. But then, a whisper of hope. An encrypted message from an ex-CIA technologist named Silas Venn. He had seen the deepfake. He knew the coding. And he told her what she already suspected. The video had been crafted using restricted neural simulation software, codenamed Prometheus Protocol, technology too advanced for any civilian contractor. This was government work. Funded, approved, directed. And behind it all, Senator Travis Callahan, the father of the officer who first brutalized her, a man with his fingerprints all over shady military appropriations, facial recognition contracts, and domestic surveillance programs. Aisha should have felt validated. Instead, she felt sick. Because now she understood. This wasn't personal. It was systemic. She was never the target. Her silence was. And now that she had refused to be erased, they were ready to destroy her in ways no bullet ever could. But she wasn't done. She teamed up with Silas and a coalition of whistleblowers, rogue journalists, civil liberties lawyers, and black tech experts who called themselves the Network. They gathered the receipts, emails, contracts, redacted files. They mapped out the command chain behind the black site. They hacked into data vaults buried in obscure government servers. They traced shell corporations back to PACs tied to Senator Callahan. And then they released it all. In one coordinated digital blitz, the truth poured out. Photos of the black site, scans of Aisha's bruised wrists, deep dive videos showing the forensic breakdown of the deepfake frame by frame. Whistleblower testimony from a federal contractor who had fled to Switzerland. The internet caught fire. Hashtags surged. Protests reignited. Major news networks were forced to retract earlier claims. The Senate opened an ethics investigation, and most damning of all, the raw footage of Aisha's initial traffic stop surfaced. The body cam audio played nationwide. Brett Callahan's voice, cold and laughing, saying, "Let's see if your little medals save you now." The tide shifted. For a moment. But Senator Callahan didn't go quietly. He claimed the evidence was foreign propaganda. He accused Aisha of orchestrating a coordinated cyber attack against patriotic institutions. He called for military tribunals to root out anti-American rot. And his supporters bought it. Protests turned violent. White supremacists staged countermarches. Aisha's motel was firebombed. She barely escaped. She hid in the mountains for weeks, surviving on canned food and filtered creek water, her skin burned, her nerves frayed, her body trembling with exhaustion. And still she fought. Still she recorded testimonial videos. Still she rallied whistleblowers. Still she gave interviews via secure feeds. Her hands shook. Her voice cracked, but she didn't stop. Because the truth was no longer just about her. It was about everyone who'd been silenced, erased, or blacklisted. She became a symbol, not of perfection, but of perseverance, of what it looked like to bleed and still stand. People began writing to her, survivors of prison abuse, black soldiers demoted for insubordination, whistleblowers fired for speaking out. Her inbox filled with cries for help and gratitude alike. Finally, after nearly a year, the Justice Department indicted Brett Callahan. The charges: assault, civil rights violations, obstruction of justice. And for the first time, the son of power was placed in handcuffs. But the bigger monster still stood: his father, Senator Travis Callahan. Aisha testified before Congress. Her voice rang with conviction. She didn't cry when she spoke. Not until she said, "I didn't survive war zones just to be tortured by my own country." The silence in that room was like gravity. And when she finished, lawmakers stood, reporters wept, veterans saluted. Travis Callahan's empire began to crumble. One by one, allies distanced themselves. Sponsors pulled out. Old scandals resurfaced. An impeachment committee formed. And still, Aisha remained calm. Because she didn't want revenge. She wanted accountability. And she wanted her name back, her rank, her truth. Eventually, the military issued a formal apology. Her record was cleared, her medals restored, but she turned down their reinstatement offer. She said she'd rather serve a country that believes in justice the first time. And now? Now Aisha Monroe travels the country. She speaks at universities, veterans' halls, cybersecurity panels. She sits across from teenage girls who once thought they'd never matter and tells them, "They only try to erase you when you threaten their comfort, so be undeniable." Her story is studied in ethics classes. Her testimony plays on screens in high schools. Her face, once branded as treason, now stands for truth. But we must never forget how close they came to erasing her. How close we came to believing the lie. How close you might be to becoming the next target if we don't fight to protect the truth. So if this story hit you, if it made your heart ache, your eyes burn, your soul rise, don't scroll past. Like this video, share it, and subscribe to Tales of Twist to support real stories like Aisha's. Leave a comment to let her know we see her, we believe her, and we're standing beside her. Because justice doesn't begin with the powerful. It begins with us. And when we refuse to look away, even the biggest monsters fall. Let me know if you'd like a trailer script, chapter breakdown, or video narration based on this version. They didn't just try to silence her, they tried to erase her. And in this new world where truth was just another line of code, they almost did. Lieutenant Colonel Aisha Monroe had survived the fists, the cuffs, the barren black sight beneath the Nevada desert. But nothing prepared her for what came after, when the battle shifted from physical brutality to a war waged in the shadows of servers and screens. She was already fragile, already walking on the edge of exhaustion, trauma, and distrust, when the video dropped. At first, she didn't even understand what she was watching. This footage of herself, sitting across from a known terrorist cell leader in an alleged overseas meeting, nodding, speaking in calm, measured tones about coordinating efforts and timing the explosions. It wasn't real. It wasn't her, but the voice was hers. The face, her face, the posture, eerily perfect. It was a deepfake, a perfect one. One that weaponized everything she had built, her rank, her career, her integrity, and turned it into a lie the world was all too eager to believe. Within hours, major news outlets were playing it on loop. Social media boiled with rage. Politicians called for her arrest. People she once led into battle posted, "If it's true, she's a disgrace." Strangers doxed her. Someone spray-painted "traitor" on her childhood home in Georgia. And Aisha? She couldn't breathe, couldn't move, couldn't stop the noise. Her phone buzzed non-stop with death threats, press demands, "You deserve to die" texts from anonymous numbers, and voicemails where people screamed at her with voices so soaked in hate she had to hold the phone away from her ear. She had spent her life upholding the truth, and now the world had turned that truth into a trap. The pain wasn't just professional, it was soul-deep. Because Aisha had bled for her country. She'd held the hands of soldiers as they died. She'd made the calls to mothers. She'd delivered folded flags and eulogies. She believed in service. And now the very institution she had given everything to, the military, the government, the people, was abandoning her without question, without hesitation. And worst of all, some part of her had always feared this moment. Because Aisha Monroe was a black woman in a system not built for black women to survive in, let alone rise within, her success had always been conditional, her authority, always a fragile privilege extended by men who didn't see her as an equal, but tolerated her because she delivered results. She had always known the leash was there, tight, invisible, dangerous. And now, the moment she threatened the machine, they yanked it. They said she was being reassigned. A polite way of saying, "Sit down, shut up, be grateful we're not prosecuting you." When she tried to speak out, her clearance was revoked. Her files locked. Her friends, those who hadn't already turned, were warned not to associate. Even Rafi, the last journalist still willing to risk everything for the truth, told her plainly. "They're flooding the net with counterintel. Every time I publish something, they bury it under 1,000 articles calling you a fraud." Aisha sat alone in a motel room that night, her back against the wall, her gun on the nightstand. Not because she was afraid of being found, but because for the first time, she wondered if all of it had been for nothing. She had nothing left. No job, no uniform, no platform, no reputation. Her name was now synonymous with treason. And still the deepfake continued to trend. Still people called her a liar. Still she scrolled through comments just to punish herself. And then she found it. A photo. A still frame from the fake video captioned, "This is what betrayal looks like." Her eyes stared back at her, but they weren't hers. The expression was too calm, too composed, too inhuman. It was her face, but not her. It was a ghost wearing her skin. Aisha dropped the phone. Her body shook, her breath hitched. She curled into herself on the floor and sobbed like a child. Not for the loss of her name, but for the loss of her reality. But even in the dark, the soldier in her never fully died. Because Aisha wasn't just a victim. She was a fighter. And deep beneath the grief, the rage began to build. Not the kind that exploded, but the kind that grew in silence. That hardened into steel. She reached out to Silas Venn, an ex-CIA cybersecurity analyst turned whistleblower living off-grid in Montana after exposing Project Echo, an AI surveillance program meant to predict civil unrest among black populations. Silas owed her. She had testified on his behalf when no one else would. When she explained the deepfake, he went quiet. Then he said the words that made her blood run cold. They used Prometheus protocol. That's government-level tech. Not even black market. You're not just being targeted. They're rewriting your existence. Silas worked night after night, sleeping in 2-hour stretches, building programs that could prove the video was fake. And finally, one morning, his voice trembled with urgency. "I found the fingerprints. It's Senator Travis Callahan's shadow group, the same bastards who funded the black site you escaped. They created this to bury you, to protect his son, to make you vanish beneath a lie so big the truth wouldn't survive it." It was never about Aisha. It was about the machine. The machine that couldn't afford a woman like her to speak, a woman who had seen the abuse, the prisons, the corruption, the secret programs designed to silence whistleblowers, the covert operations that funneled tax dollars into private warfare. She had survived the physical system, and now they were waging a digital war to kill her all over again. But this time, she fought back. She teamed up with Silas and a small network of ethical hackers, black coders, queer technologists, indigenous cybersecurity specialists, people who had also been erased, shut out, betrayed by systems that only claimed to protect them. They called themselves the Ghost Net. And together, they launched a counteroffensive. They didn't just leak the raw code behind the deepfake. They streamed it live. They hosted real-time, side-by-side comparisons, breaking down frame by frame the manipulation, the voice synthesis, the deep learning algorithms that had been weaponized to destroy her. They released email chains linking Senator Callahan's committee to funding proposals for AI experimentation on dissidents. They published internal memos from the DoD showing how plausible deniability was being used to justify black site disappearances. And then they leaked the original video, the one from the dashboard camera on the patrol car, where Officer Brett Callahan, the senator's son, brutalized a uniformed Aisha Monroe in the middle of the desert, his voice laughing as he said, "We don't salute monkeys where I come from." The world flipped overnight. The internet exploded. Hashtags surged. Protesters gathered outside government buildings with signs that said, "We see you," and "Hash justice for Monroe." Lawmakers scrambled to distance themselves. Investigations reopened, and Aisha, for the first time in months, walked outside without ducking her head. Her face, once smeared with lies, now glowed across screens, not as a traitor, but as a warrior betrayed. But even as justice clawed its way back into view, Aisha didn't rest. Because she had learned something she would never forget. In this world, truth is not enough. You have to fight for it. You have to protect it. You have to be louder than the lie. She spoke before Congress. She testified in international courts. She helped establish the first independent civilian oversight board for federal technology programs. But more than that, she became a voice for others. For every activist whose words were twisted. For every whistleblower called a liar. For every truth drowned under waves of algorithmic slander. Aisha Monroe didn't just clear her name. She built an army. She raised the next generation of digital freedom fighters, and she did it not out of vengeance, but out of love for a world that needed truth more than ever. So now we ask you, are you with her? If this story moved you, if it made you angry, if it opened your eyes, then don't stay silent. Click like, click share. Subscribe to Tales of Twist and show Aisha that she is not alone. In a world where lies go viral and truth gets buried, people like her need all of us. Because the next deepfake could be your story, your name, your life. And when that day comes, you'll want someone like Aisha Monroe fighting for you. Show her your support in the comments. Flood this post with encouragement. Let her know we see her. Let her know she's not a ghost in the machine. She's a hero in the war for reality. And the world needs more of them. Because truth has a face now. And her name is Aisha Monroe. Let me know if you'd like to develop this into a video script format, a trailer narration, or serialized episodes. I'm happy to tailor it. They thought they knew Judge Naomi Ellison. They thought they had her figured out. Just another bold black woman in a robe, out of her lane, rising too far, too fast. But what they didn't know was that Naomi had already stared into the abyss and walked out stronger. What they didn't know was that when Officer Jacob Renshaw struck her in that courtroom, when he balled his fist and shattered the illusion of order with one blow to her face, it didn't break her. It awakened something buried deep. The blow wasn't just an attack on her person. It was a message, a warning, a declaration that the system would never protect someone like her. But Naomi had received messages like that before, the kind scrawled in Sharpie on her law school door, the kind hidden in side glances from other judges, the kind that came in the form of silence from friends after the attack, when no one dared to defend her publicly. But what no one saw was what she did next, what she planned, and the risks she took that no judge had dared take before. What Naomi did, no one saw coming. After Renshaw was arrested and paraded out of the courtroom, after the courtroom footage went viral and protesters flooded the streets in her name, it looked, to the outside world, like she had won. But justice, real justice, isn't measured in viral moments. It's measured in what happens after, when the cameras turn off, when the system closes ranks, and that's exactly what it did. The police union called for her removal. A smear campaign flooded the media, fabricated stories, manipulated footage, anonymous witnesses whispering about her temper, and the biggest betrayal of all, the Chief Justice of the Circuit Court quietly urged her to take a leave of absence for her own safety. Naomi knew what that meant. Step down before they push you off the edge. But she wasn't going anywhere, not until she uncovered the truth. Because what most people didn't know, what even her closest allies didn't realize, was that Renshaw wasn't acting alone. Naomi had seen something in his eyes when he hit her. A flicker. A confidence that came from more than just a badge. It came from protection. And that protection had roots. Deep, political roots. She started to dig. She pored over court records, old cases, misconduct files that had been buried beneath bureaucratic fog, and she found them. Patterns, dismissed complaints, sealed settlements, officers transferred quietly, judges recused under pressure. It wasn't random. It was engineered. Renshaw was one piece of a machine designed to protect itself at all costs. But when she brought her findings to the district attorney, he shook his head. "You don't want to pick this fight," he said. "Not alone." Naomi stared back. "I'm not alone. Not if I make the world watch." And that's exactly what she did. She held a public press conference, not in front of the courthouse, but in front of the police headquarters itself. With trembling hands and a still swollen cheek, she stood at the podium and named names. She spoke not just of what happened to her, but what had happened for years, to the voiceless, the forgotten, the silenced. She called out the judges who bent to political pressure, the prosecutors who buried truth to keep favor. She announced the launch of an independent judicial review board funded by private legal coalitions, outside the state's control. And then she said one more thing. "There is something else, something I haven't released yet, but when I do, there will be no turning back." That single sentence sparked a wildfire of speculation. What did she have? The press spun theories, secret tapes, confidential memos, a confession. But Naomi said nothing more, because what she had wasn't evidence in the traditional sense. It was something bigger, more dangerous. And if she released it without being careful, it could destroy not just her enemies, but the entire legal infrastructure she'd spent her life trying to reform. You see, Naomi had a source. A mysterious informant, known only by the codename Wells, who claimed to be a whistleblower from inside the state's Internal Affairs Division. He had reached out after Renshaw's arrest, sending encrypted messages, slowly dropping breadcrumbs. Naomi followed every one. And what she found was chilling. A hidden server inside the district attorney's office containing confidential communications between corrupt officers, prosecutors, and politicians. A private chat room where they coordinated the suppression of misconduct, the manipulation of juries, the framing of civilians, and most damning of all, messages discussing her. Long before Renshaw ever stood in her courtroom, they had flagged her as a threat to the balance. They knew she would challenge them, and they planned to discredit her, to trigger a public response that would justify her recusal. Renshaw's outburst, it wasn't spontaneous. It was orchestrated. But Naomi couldn't prove any of this unless she got access to the full archive. And that meant taking an unbelievable risk. Late one night, in a nondescript car, she met Wells in person for the first time. He was younger than she expected. Shaky, pale, said he'd seen too much. Said he wasn't safe. Said if they knew he'd talked to her, he'd vanish before sunrise. He handed her a single flash drive. "This is only part of it," he said. "But it's enough to start a war." She asked why he chose her. His voice cracked. "Because you didn't flinch, even when he hit you." Naomi left that night knowing she had enough to bring the entire system to its knees. But there was a cost. Releasing the files would burn bridges that could never be rebuilt. The state bar would retaliate. Her future as a judge would end. Her reputation might never recover. And worst of all, they would come for her family. And still, she moved forward. She didn't sleep. She barely ate. She spent her days in court and her nights preparing the leak. She reached out to civil rights organizations, digital archivists, underground journalists. She created redundancies, safety triggers, and timed releases. And then she disappeared for 48 hours. No one knew where. The press speculated she'd fled, that she had cracked. But when she returned, she walked into court wearing the same robe she wore the day Renshaw struck her. And when she sat on that bench, the courtroom held its breath. That morning, she presided over a case involving a young black man falsely accused of assaulting an officer. The arresting officer? A close associate of Renshaw. Naomi read the case file twice, then looked up and said, "Dismissed with prejudice." The crowd gasped. "And furthermore," she continued, "I am releasing the following files into public record." She handed a flash drive to the court clerk. The room erupted. Attorneys yelled. Officers stood up. Reporters bolted out the door. But Naomi didn't move, didn't flinch, because at that moment everything she'd worked for was on the line. And in the hours that followed, the world changed. The files exposed years of corruption, judges who had been bribed, evidence that had been tampered with. Innocent people sentenced because they were inconvenient. The legal system in her state was thrown into chaos. The governor called an emergency press conference. The Chief Justice resigned. Federal investigators descended. And Naomi? She was disbarred within a week, stripped of her title, labeled a rogue, a traitor to the institution. But outside the courthouse, crowds gathered, hundreds, then thousands. They chanted her name. They held signs that read, "We believe Naomi." And when she stepped outside, her robe folded in her arms, eyes swollen from sleepless nights, she didn't speak. She didn't need to. because in the silence they roared. Now Naomi lives under constant surveillance. She moves from city to city. She receives death threats almost daily, but she also receives letters from girls who want to become judges because of her, from mothers who said her courage gave them hope, from prisoners who were released because of the files she exposed. But to this day, no one knows what she gave up to make it happen. No one knows how many times she almost stopped. No one knows how close she came to disappearing forever. Because Naomi Ellison didn't do what she did for attention. She did it for the ones they erased, the ones who didn't have her education, her platform, her name. She lost everything, but gave the truth back to the people. And now she watches from the shadows as new judges take the bench. Judges of color. Judges who cite her in their speeches. She watches as a new watchdog commission is formed, as her name becomes legend, as her sacrifice starts to bloom into something unstoppable. But Naomi is still fighting, still watching, and still wondering if the world she bled for will remember her. If you made it to the end of this story, if your heart beat faster, if you felt the fire of injustice burning in your chest, don't let Naomi's story fade into silence. Hit that like button if you stand with her. Drop a comment to let her know she's not alone. Say, "We believe you, Naomi," because she risked it all, not just for herself, but for truth, for justice, and for every single one of us who's ever been told to sit down and stay quiet. Let her know she was right to stand up. Let's make sure the world never forgets her name. Subscribe to Tales of Twist, because this story isn't over yet. They didn't see the silence that came afterward, the kind of silence that could choke a person, when the cameras left, when the last reporter packed up, when the courtroom doors finally clicked shut behind the echo of the gavel. They didn't see Judge Naomi Ellison sitting alone in her chambers, staring at the blood still drying at the corner of her mouth, her robe torn at the collar where Officer Jacob Renshaw's fist had struck like a weapon meant to humiliate, not just harm. They saw the headlines. Officer arrested for assaulting judge. They saw the outrage, the chants, the viral footage. But what they didn't see was the storm beneath the surface, the intricate darkness weaving through the city's justice system that Naomi had just disrupted with a single act of defiance, standing back up. They didn't see the quiet knock on her door later that evening. The envelope with no return address slipped underneath. Inside was a single photo. Grainy, black and white. Her teenage brother handcuffed in a back alley, blood streaming from his nose, with "Stay in your lane" scrawled in red ink across the top. They didn't see how she sat there for hours, staring at that image, her hands trembling not in fear, but in fury, in grief, in recognition. Because this wasn't just retaliation. This was a warning from a system that knew how to protect its monsters. But Naomi didn't back down. What they didn't know was that Judge Ellison had seen too much to flinch. Her mother had cleaned floors at the same courthouse where Naomi now wore the robe. Her father, a preacher who died trying to protect a boy beaten by police, had once told her, "Baby, they don't need to kill your body if they can break your name." And now that's exactly what they were trying to do. Because what happened in that courtroom wasn't an isolated act of violence. It was a trigger, a deliberate spark, part of something deeper, something buried, something Naomi had unknowingly stepped into when she ruled against the city in a civil rights case months earlier, exposing falsified police testimony. That ruling had made enemies. Enemies with badges, with gavels, with seats in the highest offices of the state. And now they were trying to make her disappear. Not by death, but by discrediting her, disqualifying her, erasing the proof she ever mattered. The attack by Officer Renshaw was just the opening act. Within days of his arrest, the retaliation began. Anonymous leaks flooded the media. Judge Ellison under investigation for ethics violations. Unnamed sources question her temperament. A conservative news outlet released a grainy photo of her at a protest years ago, claiming she was biased against law enforcement. Behind the scenes, the Judiciary Committee quietly requested her recusal from any cases involving police. Naomi's clerks stopped showing up. Her phone calls to former colleagues went unanswered. Even her mentor, an appellate judge she had once studied under, told her, "You're drawing too much heat, be careful." But Naomi didn't ask for safety. She asked for truth. Because what no one outside knew, not yet, was that after the courtroom assault, when the chaos died down and the headlines began to shift toward other stories, she started to notice something strange. The footage from inside the courtroom, the very same footage that had gone viral, began to disappear. First, it vanished from a few sites. Then it was taken down from streaming platforms. Copyright claims. Terms of service violations. Then, one night, as she was reviewing case files, her laptop suddenly restarted on its own. When it came back on, the footage file on her desktop was gone. And she knew. They were scrubbing it. Naomi understood then that this wasn't just about silencing her. It was about erasing the proof. Not just of the assault, but of the pattern, the buried evidence, the sealed cases, the orchestrated violence. She began to dig. Late at night, when the city slept, she sat in her robe, combing through sealed court documents, flagged internal memos, decades of forgotten complaints. What she found chilled her. Dozens of excessive force cases dismissed by a small, tight-knit circle of judges and prosecutors, many of whom shared a common donor, Senator Travis Callahan, a name whispered like a ghost in political circles, a man whose son just so happened to be the officer who struck her. The deeper she went, the more dangerous it became. Files were corrupted. Her internet was cut. One night, she returned home to find her apartment door ajar. Her framed photo of her father shattered on the floor. Still, Naomi pressed forward. She compiled a secret dossier, evidence connecting Callahan's office to a backdoor judicial influence network designed to bury civil misconduct, frame protesters, and neutralize disruptive judges. There were emails, call logs, surveillance footage, and at the center of it all, a name that stopped her cold. Franklin Ellison, her father. She had always believed he died defending a young man at a protest. But the files said otherwise. They said he was targeted, that he had been marked by this same system after leaking documents about racial profiling in traffic stops. The protest? That was just a cover. Naomi sank to the floor, her hand covering her mouth, the grief overwhelming, her past unraveling beneath her feet. Her father didn't die in vain. He was murdered by silence. And now they were trying to finish the job by breaking his daughter. But Naomi didn't run. She reached out to the only person who had ever told her, "We don't need saviors, we need survivors." His name was Elijah Brooks, a former civil rights attorney turned community hacker. Together, they devised a plan. Naomi would stay visible. She would keep presiding, keep writing public opinions, keep the spotlight burning, while Elijah and his team of digital archivists infiltrated the sealed files of the State Justice Network. Their goal? To find the unedited video of her courtroom assault and release it with everything else. Every corrupt memo, every buried complaint, every name. But time was running out. The state bar filed a motion for her immediate suspension. The governor's office opened a disciplinary investigation. And the final blow came when her assistant, whom she had mentored since law school, confessed that he had been approached with a bribe to steal her encrypted drive. He broke down in tears, said they threatened his family. said he couldn't do it. Naomi held him as he sobbed, her heart breaking not just for herself, but for all of them. For everyone forced to choose between survival and truth. And then, on a quiet Friday morning, the miracle happened. Elijah called her, voice trembling. "We found it, the original footage, and Naomi, there's more." They had found video footage from inside a law enforcement training seminar where officers were coached on how to agitate courtroom situations in order to trigger recusal requests for bias. And worse, they found audio of Officer Renshaw bragging about how the Callahan strategy worked best on female judges who think they've got power. Naomi sat in stunned silence. The truth wasn't just ugly, it was engineered. And she had all of it. So she did what no one expected. She walked into her final courtroom session. The press had been banned. Security was doubled. Protesters chanted outside. Inside, Naomi stood tall, face steady, voice calm, as she handed a sealed envelope to the bailiff. "Please deliver this to the state archives and unseal it publicly," she said. Then, turning to the silent courtroom, she said, "Everything you've heard about me may be true. I am emotional. I am relentless. I am not impartial when it comes to injustice. But what I am not is afraid." And with that, she stepped down from the bench. 3 hours later, the entire archive was published online. The footage, the files, the communications, the corruption. The state of Georgia erupted. The Callahan family was subpoenaed. Senator Callahan resigned in disgrace. Judges were disbarred. A task force was launched. Naomi's law license was temporarily revoked, but no one could touch her legacy. She was no longer a judge. She had become something bigger. A reckoning. In the weeks that followed, she disappeared from public view. Some said she moved to D.C. to consult. Others claimed she was writing a book. But those who knew her best said she was just resting for the first time in years. And now you know the truth. Now you understand what she went through. The beatings the public never saw. The grief she carried alone. The lies she tore down piece by piece. The risk of total erasure. The fear of being forgotten. And still she stood. Not just for herself. Not just for her father. But for all of us. If you're still here, if your heart is pounding, if your eyes are wet, if your hands are trembling at the injustice she faced, don't let Naomi's courage go unnoticed. Hit that like button to let her know she wasn't alone. Leave a comment with just 3 words. We see you. Because after everything they did to silence her, Naomi Ellison deserves to know the world finally heard her. And if you haven't yet, subscribe to Tales of Twist, because in a world full of shadows, we're here to shine light on the heroes they tried to bury. And Naomi, she just lit the fire. The day Naomi Ellison stood on the stage beneath the wide-open sky, the sun warm on her face, and thousands gathered in silence before her, she realized that her pain had not been for nothing. The years of isolation, betrayal, threats, and the bruising blow that began it all, that sickening moment when Officer Jacob Renshaw struck her in her own courtroom, had finally given way to something beautiful. Change. Real, visible, irreversible change. Behind her were months of investigations, resignations, and dismantled networks that had once operated in the shadows, protected by fear, silence, and legacy. Before her were lawmakers, activists, teachers, veterans, young women of color in law school sweatshirts, holding signs that read, "We saw you, Naomi. Justice wears your face." "Thank you, Judge." Naomi's voice had once trembled in the darkness of her apartment, her own reflection a stranger, as she doubted whether she'd ever live free from the smear campaign, the death threats, or the weight of being black, female, and unapologetically unafraid in a system built to erase women like her. But now her voice was steady, strong, carried by loudspeakers and live streams and millions of hearts listening from homes, schools, community centers, and courtrooms across the nation. "You all saw what they tried to do," Naomi began, her eyes scanning the crowd. "You saw the footage, you heard the lies, you witnessed the spin. But you also saw what truth looks like when it refuses to stay silent. They used to say the law was blind, but it wasn't. It just chose who it wanted to see. Today, I tell you, the law has no right to look away anymore." And just like that, the crowd roared, not with anger, but with hope. Because Naomi's story had become more than a cautionary tale. It was a blueprint. Not only had she exposed a deep state conspiracy, messages, video surveillance, secret chat logs coordinating takedowns of outspoken black officials, but she had also outlasted it. Refused to bow. Refused to be bought, buried, or broken. The private justice network she helped build, one that existed outside the control of corrupted unions and courts, had been adopted in 5 more cities across the country. The legal fellowship, named in her honor, now trained hundreds of young lawyers every year, teaching them not just law, but how to fight back when the law fails you. She no longer wore the judge's robe she had once earned with blood and brilliance. That robe had been stained, not by her, but by the silence of those who should have stood beside her. She gave it up. Not because she was defeated, but because she had become something bigger, a symbol, a storm, a reckoning. Her mother, once too afraid to speak Naomi's name aloud during the scandal, now sat in the front row of every speaking event, hand over her heart, tears in her eyes. "I thought they'd kill my baby," she had whispered once to a journalist. But she didn't just live. She made the truth live with her. And maybe that was the greatest lesson of all, that even when the world doesn't believe you, even when the evidence is stacked, the voices are louder, the smear is stronger, you can still win. But not by playing their game, not by stooping to their silence. You win by refusing to stop being yourself, even when it costs everything. Because Naomi had paid the price. The world watched her lose her title, her job, her savings. They watched her fiancé walk away, her friends vanish, her home vandalized. She slept on couches, changed burner phones every week, trusted no one. But in her lowest moments, those 3 a.m. spirals where she wondered if she should have just kept her head down, the people reminded her who she was. Strangers mailed her letters. Survivors of police violence sent her voice messages thanking her for speaking what they couldn't. Students painted murals. Veterans she'd once ruled against in court sent her apology letters. And slowly, the balance shifted. Not in one great sweep, but in quiet victories. Like when a black judge in Ohio ruled against a state-backed false arrest and cited the Naomi principle. Like when a mayor announced a new civilian police review board, calling Naomi Ellison's story the spark that lit the fuse. She'd thought the system would kill her. Instead, it had unknowingly made her immortal. And yet, Naomi's greatest moment didn't happen in the headlines or in the courtroom. It happened quietly. Months later, when she walked into a small library in a forgotten neighborhood of Baltimore to speak to a group of teenage girls who'd read her story. One of them, tiny, fierce, scarred by foster care and distrust, stood up and asked, "Why didn't you just give up?" Naomi knelt, took her hand, and said, "Because if I did, they'd win twice. Once by hitting me, and again by making me believe I deserved it. The girl cried. So did Naomi. You see, the system didn't just try to erase her, it tried to convince her she was the villain. It tried to turn her own reflection into something worth doubting. But Naomi didn't fall for it. She remembered every courtroom she'd ever sat in, every black mother whose son she had defended, every veteran whose trauma she had understood, every frightened witness who said, "No one ever listened before." She wasn't the villain. She was the only one who cared what happened to the ones they never mentioned in press briefings. She was the one who remembered names the system forgot, and that's what saved her. The files she released, covert communications showing years of orchestrated misconduct, protected by lawyers, politicians, and judges, led to over 45 resignations, a Senate hearing, 2 federal investigations, and a class action lawsuit that would become the largest in her state's history. Officer Jacob Renshaw? He was sentenced to 12 years. Not just for assault, but for conspiracy, obstruction, and abuse of power. And the moment his sentence was read, Naomi didn't smile. She didn't nod. She simply stood and left. Because this was never about revenge. It was always about the ones who never got their day in court, the ones who didn't survive the blow. So what can we learn from Naomi's story? We learn that silence doesn't mean defeat. That truth, when spoken with courage, multiplies. We learn that the system is only as strong as the fear we let it build. And when one woman stands, when one voice refuses to bend, walls begin to crack. We learn that justice isn't given. It's taken back, inch by inch, name by name, risk by risk. Naomi didn't win because she had power. She won because she never let power become more sacred than people. She lost everything. But in doing so, she gave us all something, a roadmap, a reason, a warning, a hope. So to anyone listening right now, to the girl wondering if her voice matters, to the man hiding his truth behind shame, to the dreamer thinking the system will never see them, don't stop speaking. Don't stop trying. Because somewhere out there, someone is waiting for your story to remind them that they are not alone. Naomi fought in darkness. But you? You get to walk in the light she made. Now, if this story touched your heart, if Naomi's courage moved you, if her resilience gave you strength, let her know. Hit that like button to stand with her. Comment below and tell us how Naomi's journey made you feel. Was there a moment that hit too close to home? Did her fight inspire something in you? Let your voice be part of this movement, and don't forget to subscribe to Tales of Twist. Because we don't just tell stories. We tell the truth behind the silence. And we have more powerful journeys just like Naomi's coming your way. The system tried to silence Naomi Ellison, but we made sure the world heard her name. Let's keep it echoing, forever.